There are evenings when cinema feels less like entertainment and more like a companion. Something you turn to because it mirrors your quiet anxieties, your quiet strength, or that faint reminder that beneath all the noise of the world, there's a human story waiting to be heard. Today, I want to welcome you into such an evening. Hello, my fellow lovers of literature and film, my dear explorers of meaning, who never settle for surface-level stories, but instead long to peel away the layers until something raw and true is revealed. You and I, in this space, are not bound by the idea of reviewing movies in the way most people do. Instead, we're holding a conversation, an almost secret exchange where what we really discuss is life, morality, and the symbols that haunt us long after credits have faded. And to spark this dialogue tonight, I bring us the Beekeeper 2024. Now, I should say from the beginning that I don't consider what follows to be a conventional movie review. It's something closer to an intellectual excavation, a critical reflection dressed in the clothes of storytelling. I'm not here to rate fight scenes, or to pit directors against one another, or to argue about box office numbers. I'm here to hold a film in my hands, turn it over, and see how it refracts against my own life and perhaps yours. If you've been here before, you know that my goal is never persuasion. It's connection. And if you're new here, welcome. You found a community that views cinema as literature, as philosophy, as an echo of the human condition. If that resonates with you, I invite you, gently, warmly, to subscribe, not out of obligation, but out of kinship, because this is more than a channel. It's a dialogue. The Beekeeper arrived to us not just as an action thriller, but as a kind of cultural moment. One of those films that wears a coat of genre picture, but conceals within it something richer, something mythic. Starring Jason Statham in one of his most primal and pared-down roles, directed with relentless grit and packaged in the sleek veneer of a modern revenge narrative, it nevertheless feels like a parable about justice, corruption, and the fragile line between ordinary citizens and the machinery of power. It is, at face value, a film about a man whose quiet life tending bees is violently interrupted, prompting him to unleash a darker, more disciplined self. But beneath that, it resonates as an allegory, one that threads through the age-old struggle between the powerless and the predators who thrive in plain sight. I confess something to you. As I watched it, I didn't see merely Jason Statham battling through hordes of faceless antagonists. I saw a meditation on order and chaos. I thought about how, in every society, there exist forces that thrive by preying on vulnerability, and how, every so often, a solitary figure emerges who dares to tilt the balance back toward dignity. It struck me that this wasn't just cinematic spectacle. It was almost fable-like. The bees themselves became a metaphor, not simply for the character's chosen livelihood, but for community, for hierarchy, for protection of the hive against threats. And suddenly I realized, this film doesn't just want to thrill me, it wants to unsettle me, to whisper something about the cost of justice in a world that shrugs at exploitation. The introduction of the film is deceptively calm. We see a man living with precision, care, and solitude, tending to bees as though each small movement were a prayer. It reminded me of how literature often begins in simplicity, how Homer begins with an invocation, how Dostoevsky begins in the everyday life of his characters, only to pull us into chaos and philosophy. This man with his bees, this quiet order, is not merely a backdrop. It's a thesis statement. He is order embodied, and we already know what stories like this demand. Order must meet disorder. The disruption comes not in the form of an earthquake or a war, but in something more insidious, more modern. The ruthless machinery of exploitation dressed in the trappings of the digital age. Here's the part that struck me personally. The villains of the story don't arrive with guns blazing. They arrive with schemes and scams, with the coldness of people who see the vulnerable not as fellow humans, but as resources to be drained. It resonated with me because we live in such a world. Maybe you've seen in your own life. The phone calls prey on elderly relatives, the corporations that consider people only as data points, the bureaucracies that grind down the weak until they can't stand anymore. Watching the film, I thought of my own encounters with that machine and the quiet fury it leaves behind. How many of us dream, if only for a moment, of someone like this Beekeeper, disciplined, relentless, incorruptible, who steps forward when everyone else turns away? The plot teases itself in layers. First, there's a loss that drives him, the shattering of his fragile peace. Then comes the revelation that he is no ordinary man, but one with a past honed in violence, a past he has tucked away in pursuit of quiet dignity. And then comes a choice to unearth that past, to rearm himself, not for conquest or money, but for justice. This is the skeleton of the story, the bones upon which the flesh of action and emotion are draped. Yet even as the plot gears itself toward vengeance, it feels like something more timeless, an echo of the lone avenger archetype, stretching from Gilgamesh through Odysseus to the Western gunslinger and the noir detective. The film knows this, and it leans into it. And here's where my admiration deepens. For all its action choreography, the movie never lets you forget the bees. They are constant, silent reminders. Every swarm, every hum, every metaphor buzzing just beneath the surface. A hive thrives only when order is maintained, when threats are expelled, when each member fulfills its duty. Isn't that what the beekeeper himself embodies? His violence, paradoxically, is about restoring balance, about ensuring the hive survives. It's not random carnage, it's surgical. And that precision elevates the story, because suddenly we're no longer watching just a revenge thriller, we're witnessing the enactment of philosophy. This, my friends, is what excites me most about films like this. They are Trojan horses. They ride on the wheels of adrenaline and spectacle, but inside they carry the weight of allegory, of social critique, of deeply human questions. As I sat there, I didn't just feel entertained, I felt implicated. Because if the beekeeper is about protecting the hive, then who is protecting ours? Who is guarding the vulnerable in our neighborhoods, in our communities, in our fractured systems? The movie poses this question without ever stating it outright. And isn't that the essence of art? Not to answer, but to unsettle, to make you look again at the world you thought you understood. So tonight, as we embark on this deep dive together, I want you to treat this not as a review, but as a shared meditation. We'll walk through the narrative, yes, but more than that, we'll wander into the undercurrents, the themes of justice and corruption, the symbols of bees and hives, the tension between solitude and responsibility. We'll ask ourselves why these archetypes endure, why audiences still lean forward when a lone figure declares war against corruption, and what it says about us that we find comfort in such stories. I welcome you, then, not as passive viewers, but as fellow readers of cinema. Let's hold this film like a text, like a story told around a fire, and listen for the echoes it leaves in our own lives. The Beekeeper isn't just about one man. It's about the fragile hive we all inhabit and the price of defending it. And as we move deeper into its world, scene by scene, I invite you to let its symbols sting, its silences hum, and its story remind you that cinema, like literature, is always about more than what it seems. There is something almost meditative about the way the story begins, quiet in its rhythm, as though we are invited to breathe alongside a man who has found refuge in simplicity. The image of a beekeeper tending to his hives is more than an opening. It's a declaration. Every movement is precise. The lifting of frames, the careful inspection of combs, the hum of bees that sounds less like noise and more like a chorus. It feels like the heartbeat of the film, this small ritual of order and devotion. To me, it recalled those passages in novels where the author lingers on daily tasks, not because they are thrilling, but because they are grounding. We meet him not in chaos, but in control, a man who has earned his peace. And yet, as viewers, we sense something lurking beneath. No action thriller begins with peace unless it intends to shatter it. The fragility of that calm becomes painfully clear when his neighbor, an elderly woman, someone whose warmth feels instantly genuine, becomes a victim. At first, it seems like a simple intrusion from the outside world, one of those scam calls we've all received, the kind that promise fake technical help or drain bank accounts. But here, the consequences are catastrophic. She falls prey to a merciless digital scheme that wipes out her savings and leaves her devastated. I couldn't help but think of how modern villainy often arrives not with bullets or fists, but with algorithms, phishing links, and manipulation of trust. It is a 21st century cruelty, faceless but devastating. Watching it unfold, I remember moments when my own loved ones had nearly been trapped by similar schemes, and how anger simmers when you realize someone out there profits from such targeted exploitation. When she takes her own life after the violation of her dignity and security, The story crosses a threshold. This is no longer about a man and his bees. It's about grief igniting purpose. For him, this tragedy is unbearable not only because of the loss, but because it is unjust, preventable, and cruel. It is here that the stillness cracks, and the past begins to seep through. We don't yet know the full extent of who he is, but we begin to sense it. This is no ordinary recluse, no mere farmer of bees. His stillness was not the stillness of inexperience, but of restraint. And now restraint has been burned away. The first half of the film builds itself with deliberate pacing. He begins to trace the scam back to its roots, and the trail leads not to some faceless overseas server, but to a deeply entrenched network operating with impunity. The cleverness of the film is that it doesn't depict these criminals as shadowy figures in dark rooms alone. They are protected, almost institutionalized, feeding off the vulnerable while hiding under protection of the powerful. We glimpse call centers buzzing with exploitation, with operators who speak like machines while draining the lifeblood of real people. The juxtaposition is chilling. The beekeeper's quiet rituals of care against the cold efficiency of predation. As he follows the path, fragments of his identity begin to surface. The man who seemed solitary and perhaps fragile reveals a knowledge of violence, an understanding of systems, and a discipline that speaks of a life long before bees. The name Beekeeper itself begins to take on dual meaning, not only the literal one, but as an operative, a guardian from a shadowy past. The mythology grows. He is not simply an angry man, but a figure from an order, a clandestine program. The kind of archetype who was once a weapon but now has chosen retreat. And yet retreat has been denied him. I found myself moved here because it echoed a literary trope I have always admired. The reluctant hero, the man who has left the sword behind only to find it forced back into his hands. Think of Odysseus, pulled from home into war. Think of the Ronin in Japanese tales, summoned back to vengeance. The beekeeper is part of that lineage. The difference is that here, the enemy is not a single warlord or king, but the architecture of corruption itself. The first missions he undertakes are small in scope, almost reconnaissance. He targets the local nodes of the scam operation, dismantling them with precision. These scenes are not merely action showcases. They are symphonies of control. Every strike, every step, is efficient, calculated. I notice how the filmmakers chose not to indulge in excess here. Violence is never glamorized but sharpened into necessity. And with each confrontation, the hive metaphor strengthens. He is purging infection from the comb, excising rot before it spreads. But soon his actions draw attention. The scam operation is not isolated. It is connected to higher chains of power, to wealthy figures with political reach. Here lies one of the film's deeper critiques. Corruption doesn't survive in the margins. It thrives in the mainstream, nourished by the very structures meant to protect citizens. The beekeeper becomes a threat, not just to criminals, but to the architects of a predatory system. And so, opposition begins to marshal against him. There's a sequence midway through the first half that stayed with me. A confrontation inside a buzzing office filled with cubicles, where dozens of scammers operate like worker bees inverted, feeding not the hive but draining it. He moves through the space like a shadow, a presence both terrifying and righteous. As he disables the operation, I thought about how allegory sometimes hides in plain sight. Here was a hive corrupted, a perversion community, turned not toward survival but exploitation. He was not destroying a hive. He was restoring balance by eradicating the false one. The first half crescendos as his actions escalate. We learn more about the beekeepers as a program, the shadow organization that trained him, and how their ethos was rooted in ruthless efficiency but tempered by purpose. He is not merely an avenger. He is a product of an ideology, one that has made him uniquely capable of standing against these networks. The layering of myth and realism here is compelling. On the surface, it is an action thriller. Beneath, it feels almost biblical, the lone righteous figure cleansing the temple of corruption. What makes this half so compelling, at least for me, is how personal it feels. Though the scale of the story expands, touching powerful figures, corporations, politics, the core remains intimate. A man avenging the dignity of a neighbor, an ordinary woman crushed by extraordinary cruelty. It reminds us that behind every statistic, every news headline about scams or fraud, There is a human face, often one too fragile to endure the loss. The Beekeeper's war is not abstract. It is heartbreak turned into motion. And so, by the time the first half closes, we have moved from quiet solitude among hives to a storm brewing across institutions. The Beekeeper has revealed himself not only to his enemies but to us, a man of terrifying discipline, driven not by greed but by grief, not by chaos but by order. The hive he protects is humanity itself, and the infection he fights is one we recognize from our own lives, our own societies. The stage is set for escalation, for confrontation with the machinery of power itself. The storm that had been gathering in the first half breaks open in the second. By now, his presence can no longer be dismissed as an isolated disturbance. The damage he has inflicted on the fraudulent networks is too precise, too disruptive, and the powerful men behind the scheme are unsettled. At first, they believe they are chasing down just another vigilante, perhaps a former soldier, someone angry enough to throw away his life. But slowly, as whispers about who he really is spread, fear begins to creep in. He is not just one man. He is a legend resurrected, a ghost from a secret order. The Beekeepers, an organization whose members were trained to be both invisible and unstoppable. The realization sends ripples of panic through corridors of power, and it is in their desperation that the stakes rise. What fascinates me here is the way the movie widens its lens without losing intimacy. The scam no longer feels like a small nest of criminals, but like a monstrous machine, extending all the way up into political spheres. We see senators, lobbyists, and men in expensive suits who speak with the calm of untouchable authority, suddenly rattled by the possibility that someone is willing to tear apart their fortress brick by brick. And all the while, at the center of the storm, there's a man who moves with singular purpose, guided by grief yet sharpened by discipline. I felt the pull of myth here, the lone hero storming the citadel, not with armies at his back, but with conviction burning in his chest. The confrontations in the second half become larger, more theatrical, yet never lose their sting of realism. There's a sequence where he tracks a chain of fraud to an extravagant mansion, a palace of excess built on a ruin of ordinary people. He moves through its halls not as a guest but as an executioner, dismantling security, disabling guards, exposing the decadence for what it is, a hive turned cancerous. The imagery struck me hard. Here were chandeliers glittering above men who profited from misery, and here was the Beekeeper, a shadow moving through their world like justice incarnate. When the violence erupts, it isn't chaos, it's cleansing. Each moment is stripped of indulgence, reduced to raw necessity. As the film builds toward its midpoint climax, one of the most powerful threads emerges. The tension between who he was trained to be and who he is choosing to be now. He is not bound by orders anymore, no government, no secret agency dictating his actions. The morality is his own, and that raises questions I found lingering long after scenes ended. When justice is left undone by systems, when the vulnerable are abandoned, what role does the individual play? Is it righteousness or arrogance to step into the void and enforce balance? The film never preaches, but it leaves the question suspended, buzzing like the hum of bees in the background. Eventually, the scale of opposition grows so vast that even the government becomes involved not to aid him, but to stop him. A man operating outside the system, even if righteous, is a threat to the system itself. We see federal agents circling, police barricades rising, strategies laid to corner him. Yet with every attempt he slips through, not because of luck, but because of the precision of his craft. He has trained his entire life for invisibility, for efficiency, for survival. I thought of it like watching a chess master play not against one opponent, but an entire room of them. Each move anticipated, each counter neutralized before it can land. The real escalation comes when the true puppet masters reveal themselves. The faceless scam isn't just about call centers or offshore accounts. It is tethered to a figure of immense political influence. The son of a powerful politician, entitled and ruthless, emerges as one of the linchpins. Protected by the armor of wealth and family legacy, he believes himself untouchable. Watch him sneer, surrounded by men who shield him. I felt that familiar anger rise. The frustration we all know when systems bend over backwards to protect the powerful, while the weak are left to crumble. It is here that the Beekeeper's mission takes on almost biblical resonance. He is no longer dismantling fraud. He is toppling idols of corruption. The battles intensify. Warehouses burn, networks collapse, and each step draws him closer to the heart of rot. The second half of the film does not shy away from spectacle, gunfights, close combat, explosive set pieces. But beneath the spectacle is a beating heart of metaphor. Every action sequence is designed not just a thrill, but to echo the philosophy of the hive. Order must be restored. The infection must be cleansed. I found myself less focused on the choreography of punches and bullets, and more on the way each fight felt symbolic. One man standing against the illusion of power, showing for the fragility it truly is. There is a scene late in the film where he confronts a swarm of bodyguards protecting a figurehead of the operation. It should be impossible. The odds are too great, the walls too high. Yet he moves through them like a storm, not with reckless rage, but with precise, almost surgical calm. Watching it, I thought of Milton's line, "They also serve who only stand and wait." Except here it was inverted. He serves by moving, by refusing to wait, by acting where others have been silent. It reminded me of the responsibility literature often places upon its heroes. Not to win easily, but to endure against impossible odds, because endurance itself is a kind of truth. As the climax approaches, the threads converge. The politician whose son has orchestrated the scams faces exposure, and the Beekeeper forces him into confrontation. This is not merely a battle of fists, but of ideologies. The man who has lived by order and sacrifice standing against the man who has thrived on exploitation and entitlement. Their clash is not just personal. It is societal. The camera lingers on their words, their glares, their silences, and in that tension the entire film crystallizes. This is not about bees or scams anymore. It is about what kind of hive we allow to exist. Do we accept one ruled by predators? Or do we demand one protected by guardians? The resolution is fierce, inevitable. The sun falls. The networks collapse. The illusion of invincibility shatters. Yet the film does not end with triumphalism. Instead, it circles back to quiet. The Beekeeper returns to his hives, the hum of bees rising once more, echoing the opening. What has been done cannot undo the tragedy that set him on this path. His neighbor is still gone, the wound still raw, but order for now has been restored. The hive breathes again. It is bittersweet, and that is precisely why it lingers. As the credits rolled, I found myself reflecting on the cyclical nature of the story. He began in solitude, was torn into violence, and returned again to solitude. But he is no longer the same man. The bees hum differently now, not as a lullaby, but as a reminder. For me, it felt like the perfect allegory for our own struggles. We, too, tend to our small lives, our fragile rituals, until injustice forces us to awaken. And though we may return to routine afterward, we are never the same. Justice, once demanded, changes us. The second half of the film is not just a conclusion. It is a meditation. It shows us the cost of vigilance, the necessity of guardianship, and the inevitability of corruption unless we choose to confront it. And in that sense, the Beekeeper is not just one man. He is an idea, that in every hive there must be someone willing to protect the vulnerable, even if it costs them their peace. What lingers in me after the story ends is not simply the image of fists colliding or buildings burning, but the faces and silences of the characters who carried the weight of this tale. A film like this, dressed as an action thriller, could easily reduce its people to archetypes. The stoic avenger, the helpless victim, the faceless villains. Yet what sets it apart, at least in my experience, is the way each character breathes, each of them carrying not just a role in the plot, but a reflection of our world. They are not grandly philosophical in their dialogue, but they embody philosophies through their choices, through what they protect and what they destroy. And in examining them, we begin to see the marrow of the film's meaning. At the center is Adam Clay, the Beekeeper himself, played with that tightly wound precision Jason Statham has mastered over the years. What fascinates me about him is not his violence, though it is crafted to appear inevitable, but his restraint. His introduction in the film is a man tending bees, and I think that's the truest version of him. Someone who longs for order, simplicity, and community. Violence in his world is not expression but disruption. He doesn't smile at it, doesn't relish it, doesn't wear it like a badge. It is only when injustice tears the fragile hive he has created that he summons the part of himself he thought he had buried. For me, that makes him less a killer and more a monk. His silence is monastic, his movements disciplined, and his violence ritualistic in a way that feels closer to duty than desire. In him I saw echoes of characters like Cincinnatus, the Roman farmer general who returned his plow after defending the Republic. It's that archetype of reluctant guardianship, a theme that always speaks to me because it suggests that true strength lies not in the thirst for power, but in the ability to walk away from it. The neighbor, Eloise, whose tragedy sets the story in motion, may not occupy much screen time, but her presence haunts every frame afterward. She is written not as a cliché old woman, but as someone brimming with quiet warmth, the kind of neighbor who carries humanity in her smile. That's why her fall is devastating. It's not only her life ending that wounds us, but the sense that the world had no shield for her. She becomes both character and symbol, a reminder that corruption preys not on the strong, but on the trusting, the vulnerable. In literature, such figures often exist to remind us what is worth fighting for. She is the face of innocence crushed by machinery, and in her absence, she becomes the soul of the film. I kept thinking, we don't rage because she is gone. We rage because she should never have been left unprotected in the first place. Opposite Clay stand the villains, and I use that word cautiously because the film paints them not as cartoonish, but as chillingly real. At the ground level are the scammers in their buzzing offices, worker bees inverted, each called draining the life from the elderly, the lonely, the gullible. They are interchangeable, and that's precisely what makes them terrifying. It isn't one villain, but a system of them, a faceless swarm. They represent how modern cruelty disguises itself as business, how exploitation hides behind headsets and scripts. I could not hate them as individuals, because they are barely individuals at all. They are cogs. And that, I think, is the point. They remind us that evil often doesn't look like a villain twirling a mustache. It looks like ordinary people obeying orders in exchange for a paycheck. Then at the higher tier comes Derek Danforth, the entitled son of a politician, whose arrogance and cruelty anchor the corruption. He is every spoiled heir we have seen in literature and in life, a man who believes in his invincibility, because the system has never allowed him to feel consequences. There's a kind of mythic necessity in his presence. Stories like this need a face, a person we can pin our outrage upon, even when we know the real disease is structural. Danforth embodies privilege metastasized into predation. Watching him sneer, protected by wealth and power, I felt that simmering frustration we feel when we read about scandals in the real world, when corruption makes the headlines but accountability never follows. He is not unique, and that's what makes him unforgettable. Alongside him, there is his mother, the congresswoman whose political power shields the entire operation. She is a perfect embodiment of hypocrisy, a public servant who, in private, serves only her own dynasty. What fascinated me about her portrayal was not her corruption. We expect that, but her composure. She is calm, rehearsed, almost serene in her manipulation. Unlike her son, she doesn't flaunt her arrogance. She cloaks it in the language of responsibility, of policy, of duty. That contrast makes her even more dangerous, because while her son is reckless enough to be noticed, she is careful enough to endure. And that duality between them feels like an echo of the world we know. The young, entitled heirs who act brazenly because they have never been denied, and the seasoned guardians of power who quietly perpetuate systems of exploitation without ever raising their voices. Another figure who fascinated me is Verona Parker, the FBI agent drawn into the Beekeeper's orbit. At first, she represents the system, the law that seeks to rein him in. She chases him not out of malice but out of duty, believing that what he is doing cannot be sanctioned. Yet as she learns more about the rot he is exposing, her conflict deepens. She is, in many ways, our entry point, the character who wrestles with the grayness of justice, who realizes that legality and morality are not always aligned. Her arc, for me, is about awakening, about choosing to see not just what is written in the law, but what is true in the heart. I loved her not because she saves the day, she doesn't, but because she reminds us of the struggle between conscience and duty that defines so many lives. And then always humming beneath the story. They're the bees themselves. They are not characters in the literal sense, but in the symbolic sense. They are omnipresent. Every time Clay returns to them, every time their buzzing fills the soundtrack, they remind us of what this is really about. The hive, the vulnerable, the delicate balance of order. They are more than insects. They are moral witnesses. In them, I saw the chorus of a Greek tragedy, not speaking in words but in sound, reminding us of the stakes, lamenting the losses, singing the necessity of justice. In the interplay of these characters, the film becomes more than action. Clay is not simply a man avenging a neighbor. He is an embodiment of reluctant duty. Eloise is not merely a victim. She is the spirit of what must be defended. Danforth and his mother are not just villains. They are the manifestation of systemic corruption. Verona is not just an agent. She is the conscience torn between law and truth. And the bees are the hymn that ties it all together. What I love most, though, is how these characters refuse to let the story become simple. Clay is not a hero in the Hollywood sense. His violence leaves scars. His mission is as much burden as purpose. Eloise's death is not undone, her absence not filled by justice. The villains do not stand alone, but as symptoms of deeper disease. Even Verona, for all her awakening, is left in the tension of a broken system. This complexity is what makes them literary, what makes the film feel like a text worth analyzing rather than just watching. Each character reflects a facet of ourselves, of our society, of our fears and hopes. And when the credits roll, we don't leave with a single hero to cheer, but with a hive of questions buzzing inside us. What I find most enchanting when I step away from the screen and look behind it is how many strange and almost mythic details surround the making of The Beekeeper. The movie wears itself as a lean action thriller on the surface, but peel back its production history, its inspirations, and the atmosphere on set, and you begin to see a tapestry of oddities and fascinating accidents that feel as if they belong to the story itself. They make the film less a manufactured product and more a living thing, a hive of its own with workers, rituals, mishaps, and legends buzzing inside it. One of the strangest things I discovered is that Jason Statham, before agreeing to play Adam Clay, actually spent time with real beekeepers in England. He wanted to understand the rituals, the patience, the calm discipline it required to handle bees. And apparently, on his very first day visiting a hive, he was stung not once, but several times in succession. Most actors would laugh it off as part of research, but Statham took it as a kind of initiation. He even joked in an interview that the bees were testing whether he was worthy to play a man who lived among them. I love that image. The stoic action star who has fought cinematic armies and leapt off skyscrapers, humbled by creatures that weigh less than a gram. It's poetic in a way, because it reflects Clay's own arc in the story. Power humbled, violence tempered by smallness, strength rediscovered only after first being stung. The choice of David Ayer as director carries its own peculiar weight. Known for End of Watch and Fury, Ayer has always gravitated towards stories of men caught between morality and violence. Yet when he first read the script for The Beekeeper, he reportedly thought it was too strange to pass up. An action film centered on bees? A secret society of vigilantes calling themselves beekeepers? It sounded to him like pulp. But what hooked him was the metaphor, the same one that hooked audiences later. The hive as society, the beekeeper as guardian. Ayer has spoken about how, during shooting, he would often remind cast and crew, remember, we're not just shooting an action scene, we're showing order fighting chaos. That mantra apparently became a kind of inside joke, whispered whenever the set descended into the chaos of explosions or logistical mayhem. Another curious fact, the production faced unexpected interruptions due to real bees. Some scenes were shot near live hives brought on set for authenticity, and despite professional handlers, swarms would occasionally disrupt filming. Crew members would suddenly scatter, cameras left rolling as tiny invaders filled the air. One assistant recalled that the sound crew had nightmares because the bees' hum was picked up in the boom mics, sometimes making it nearly impossible to separate from the score. In post-production, the sound designers leaned into it, incorporating real hive recordings into the film's background ambience. So when you hear that low hum in the movie, it isn't just sound design. It's a genuine vibration of bees, captured in uncontrolled moments. That detail, for me, transforms a film. It means the bees are not just symbols. They are participants in the story. And then there are the smaller, odder details that only surface when you look closely. The protagonist's farmhouse, for example, wasn't a set but a real property in Massachusetts. It had once belonged to a family of amateur apiarists. When the crew arrived, they discovered remnants of old hives still scattered across the land, weathered and abandoned. Ayer decided not to remove them, insisting they stay in the background of shots as subtle evidence of history. It makes me wonder, how many viewers noticed? How many realize that in some frames, the wooden boxes we see aren't props, but the relics of real bees who once lived there? It gives the film an almost archaeological texture, fiction layered over truth. One of my favorite bits of trivia involves the villain's call center set. Designed to look like a modern scam operation, it was built inside an abandoned office building in London. The art department filled it with hundreds of fake cubicles, computers running phony programs designed to look like malware scams. But here's the twist. During filming, one of the prop computers accidentally connected to a real network, and for a brief moment, the fake scam interface began interacting with real web traffic. IT specialists had to be called in to sever the connection. The crew laughed about it later, saying the set almost became a real scam hub. Again, it's eerie, the fiction of predation nearly bleeding into reality. Jason Statham himself brought his own odd rituals to the set. Known for doing many of his stunts, he insisted on performing a sequence involving fire without a double. The pyrotechnics team designed the scene carefully, but during one take, the fire spread unpredictably, forcing Statham to improvise his escape. That exact take ended up in the final cut. And if you watch closely, you can see a flicker of genuine panic in his eyes. It's subtle, but adds a layer of authenticity you can't choreograph. To me, that speaks of cinema's strange alchemy, how accents often make the art richer than intention ever could. There's also the curious matter of the screenplay's origins. Co-written by Sylvester Stallone, the script reportedly began as a loose adaptation of a revenge novel unrelated to bees. It was Stallone who suggested weaving in apiarist imagery, inspired by his own childhood fascination with honeybees. At first, producers resisted, fearing audiences would find it ridiculous. But Stallone argued that without metaphor, the story would just be another revenge thriller lost in the crowd. His instincts proved correct. The very strangeness of the bee motif is what set the film apart, what made critics and audiences talk. Isn't that strange? That what seemed too odd became the story's heart? Even the film's score carries unusual history. Composer David Sardi wove actual recordings of bees into his compositions, slowing and layering them until they sounded like ominous drones beneath strings and percussion. At times, what we think is a synthesizer is actually the pitch-shifted hum of thousands of wings. The music, then, is not just accompaniment but atmosphere, nature's own instruments reimagined as the heartbeat of vengeance. It makes me think of how art, at its most alive, blurs boundaries between the real and the crafted, between accident and intention. Of course, no film is free from a share of accidents that later read like omens. During one night shoot, a thunderstorm hit the set unexpectedly, forcing the crew to shelter under tents. Statham reportedly stayed outside, watching the storm, bees still buzzing faintly in their hives nearby. A crew member swears he heard a mutter, "Nature keeps the balance better than we do." Whether apocryphal or not, that anecdote has floated around interviews as if it were part of the myth-making surrounding the film. It feels almost scripted, but maybe the best truths do. What I carry away from all these strange facts is a sense that The Beekeeper was never just a film stitched together by schedules and budgets. It was a hive in itself, unpredictable, buzzing, full of mishaps that somehow enriched the story. From real bees disrupting soundtracks to actors stung into humility, from abandoned hives appearing on screen to fictional scams nearly becoming real, the film's production mirrored its own themes. Chaos intruding on order, vulnerability demanding vigilance. It is as if the universe itself conspired to remind the filmmakers what their story was about. And isn't that, in its own way, the most fitting tribute? That a story about hives and guardians, predators and protectors, would find itself shaped by real swarms, real stings, real accidents that demanded adaptation? It makes the movie less a closed work of fiction and more a living text, buzzing with the energy of its making. To me, that is the strangest and most beautiful fact of all, that art, like a hive, is alive only because of the unpredictable movements of its workers and the accidents that force it into resilience. There are certain moments in a film that refuse to remain only scenes. They linger, demand reflection, and seem to echo far beyond their runtime. In The Beekeeper, the major events unfold with the precision of an action thriller, yet when I sit with them, they feel less like entertainment and more like parables disguised in adrenaline. It's worth pausing here with you to look at these turning points critically, not to summarize them, but to weigh them as symbols, as cultural mirrors, as emotional mirrors. The first event that still trembles inside me is Eloise's downfall. The elderly neighbor, gentle and kind, who becomes prey to a scam that strips her of everything. At face value, it is a plot device, the inciting incident that sets Adam Clay on his path. But from a critical lens, it is so much more. Her devastation is not just about money. It is about the shattering of dignity, the destruction of safety in a world already fragile. Watching her succumb to despair, I thought how modern villainy rarely arrives in the form of visible monsters anymore. Instead, it creeps in through phone calls, emails, scams that know exactly how to exploit loneliness and trust. Eloise is not just a character. She is our mothers, our grandparents, anyone who has ever been told by society that they are safe, only to be abandoned when the wolves arrive. Her death forces a question. In a civilization obsessed with innovation and profit, who guards the vulnerable? This question is the hive's first fracture. The second event that demands analysis is Clay's decision to act. Stories like this often present violence as an eruption of rage. But here it is something else. A deliberate choice to unearth a part of himself he had locked away. He could have mourned silently, tended his bees, and allowed the machinery of corruption to keep turning. Instead, he takes upon himself the role of the avenger, though it's important to see it less as revenge and more as reclamation of balance. Critically, this is where the film steps into allegory. He does not act simply because he is angry. He acts because order has been broken. In his hands, violence becomes ritual, like pruning diseased branches to save a tree. We must ask, is this justice, or is it vigilantism dressed as morality? The ambiguity is deliberate, and that is what makes it powerful. A third critical event lies in the exposure of the call center, the hive inverted. Here, the symbolism is almost too precise to ignore. A room buzzing with voices, workers laboring not for survival of community, but for its exploitation, drones not protecting the hive, but hollowing it from within. When Clay storms that space, dismantling it with terrifying calm, we are not just watching an action set piece. We are witnessing the allegorical destruction of a false hive. It is a chilling critique of how our world has replaced genuine community with systems that mimic it only to exploit it. Corporations that use the language of family, governments that use the language of service, scams that use the language of help. What makes this scene critical is not the fist flying, but the philosophy buzzing beneath. Not all hives are worth protecting. Some must be destroyed so that the real ones can survive. The escalation to the political realm is another turning point that deserves scrutiny. When the story reveals that the fraud is not isolated but tethered to power, when we see the entitled Ayer and his mother, the congresswoman, this is where the film stops being personal and becomes structural. It critiques the unholy marriage between crime and politics, between exploitation and legitimacy. The son, brash and reckless, is an easy target for our anger, but the mother is subtler. She cloaks her corruption in rhetoric, in the performance of responsibility. From a critical standpoint, she is perhaps the more dangerous of the two, because she represents the way systems perpetuate themselves not through chaos, but through order maintained in service of rot. She is the perfect inversion of Clay. He uses order to protect the hive. She uses order to drain it. Their eventual collision is not simply character versus character. It is philosophy versus philosophy. The climactic confrontations carry another layer of meaning. Critics might view them as formulaic action, but beneath the spectacle lies a meditation on inevitability. Clay's advance is not fueled by invincibility, but by inevitability, like a natural force correcting imbalance. Each fight scene, in this light, becomes less about choreography and more about metaphor. When he dismantles security teams, storming fortresses of wealth. What we are seeing is not just man against man, but the fragile illusion of power collapsing against the reality of conviction. Guns, guards, and influence falter not because they are weak in themselves, but because they are hollow when measured against something rooted in purpose. The confrontation with Derek Danforth, the son, is another event that resonates critically. He embodies entitlement, a man who has never been told no, who has built his life on the presumption of impunity. His downfall is not merely his defeat, it is his exposure. For him, the true punishment is not death, but the shattering of the illusion that he is untouchable. In mythic terms, he is Icarus, flying on wings of wealth and power, only to be brought down by his own arrogance. The Beekeeper does not merely kill him, he punctures the illusion he represents. Perhaps the most profound moment, however, lies not in combat, but in return. After the storm of violence, Clay returns to his bees, the hum of the hive resuming as if nothing has happened. This bookend is easy to miss as symbolic repetition, but critically, it resonates like a cycle. The man has restored order, but at what cost? The hive is safer now, but the loss that propelled him cannot be undone. The world is not redeemed, only temporarily balanced. To me, this is the film's most honest admission. Justice is never final. It must be enacted again and again by whoever has the strength to rise. The quiet hum at the end is not peace, but reminder. Thematically, these events together form a critique of modern society's failures. Eloise's death exposes the vulnerability of the weak. The scam center critiques the false hives that exploit. The political corruption highlights the system's complicity. The climax critiques the illusion of invulnerability among the privileged. And finally, Clay's return to the hive reminds us that the cycle of injustice and guardianship never truly ends. From a critical perspective, this is not just an action thriller. It is a fable for an age where institutions fail and individuals must bear the burden of justice. What I love is how the film refuses to give us comfort. Yes, villains fall. Yes, the scam collapses. But the wound remains. Eloise does not return. Corruption is not destroyed everywhere. Clay himself remains in solitude. The story whispers a truth literature has always known. Justice is never perfect, and the hive is never permanently safe. The role of the Beekeeper is eternal as the vulnerability of the hive itself. In the end, what makes these events so significant is not their surface drama, but the questions they pose. Who protects the weak when systems fail? What is the difference between justice and vengeance? When does order become tyranny? And when does violence become salvation? These are not questions the film answers. Instead, it leaves them buzzing, like the hum of bees in the background, demanding that we carry them with us into our own world. There's always a secret film hidden inside the one we watch on screen. The film that happened behind the camera in long nights, strange accidents, small triumphs, and endless experiments. The Beekeeper is no exception. In fact, I think the oddities and struggles of its production mirror the movie's own themes. Order wrestling with chaos, patience tested, balance restored only through persistence. To talk about this film's making is to step into another hive, buzzing with workers, each with their role, sometimes stung, sometimes sweetened, but always laboring towards something bigger than themselves. The decision to pair Jason Statham with David Ayer was already unusual. Ayer, known for Fury and End of Watch, had carved a reputation for gritty, grounded stories, while Statham was Hollywood's action machine, known for precision in choreography. The marriage of their approaches created tension at first. Ayer's instinct was always to dig for realism, to let messiness and unpredictability bleed into the frame. Statham, by contrast, was almost obsessive about timing, about economy of motion. Crew members spoke of days where they would debate whether a fight should look brutal and raw, would miss punches and stumbles, or whether it should appear clean and calculated, like a ritual of violence. In the end, both instincts merged. The fights in The Beekeeper feel surgical yet weighty, like a man who is trained for order but is battling chaos itself. It's fascinating that this synthesis wasn't designed from the start, but discovered through clashes on set. One of the more charming production insights involves the bees themselves. To capture authenticity, the filmmakers decided early on that they would use real bees in certain scenes, supervised by professional apiarists. What they didn't anticipate was how much those bees would dictate the rhythm of the set. During one sequence shot on the farmhouse property, a handler misjudged the temperature conditions, and the hive became restless. Dozens of bees swarmed lights and cameras, forcing the entire crew to evacuate while Statham calmly stayed behind, watching the chaos with a smirk. "This is their set, not ours," he reportedly said. It became a motto among crew members. Whenever production hit a snag, someone would mutter, "It's their set, not ours," a gentle reminder that sometimes a film must adapt to forces beyond control. Sound design, too, has its fun little legends. The audio team wanted the hum of bees to bleed into the soundtrack, not as literal sound but as texture. To achieve this, they recorded thousands of bees in motion and then digitally manipulated the audio, lowering the pitch until it resembled a deep drone. In some moments, what we hear as a sinister musical undercurrent is in fact the slowed hum of insects. This discovery was partly accidental. A sound engineer experimenting late at night stretched a recording far beyond its natural length and realized it sounded like an ominous organ note. That mistake became a key part of the film's soundscape. Isn't it curious how the accidents often define the soul of a film more than planned elements? The call center sequences carry their own behind-the-scenes lore. Filmed in an abandoned London office building, the set was so meticulously dressed with fake computers and scam scripts that at one point, local authorities mistook it for an actual fraudulent operation. A minor investigation was launched before producers clarified it was a movie set. Crew members laughed about the irony. A fake scam so convincing it almost got them in trouble with the law. It was yet another reminder that fiction and reality were dancing dangerously close throughout this production. Jason Statham's commitment to stunts is already legendary, but here he took things further than most directors would dare allow. In a sequence involving fire, he refused to use a double, insisting that authenticity mattered more than safety padding. When flames spread unpredictably during one take, Ayer nearly called cut, but Statham pushed through, improvising his escape. That raw footage, tinged with genuine danger, became part of the final cut. Later, stunt coordinators admitted that moments shaved years off their lives and stress. But isn't it strange how actors sometimes blur the line between performance and reality so much that you can no longer tell whether you're watching craft or survival? Another fun fact lies in the screenplay's origin. Few people know that Sylvester Stallone had a hand in shaping it. He contributed story ideas, one of which was to be motif itself. Stallone, fascinated since childhood by hives and their symbolism, pushed for weaving apiarist imagery into what would otherwise have been a straightforward revenge thriller. Producers resisted at first, but Stallone argued that without metaphor, the story would drown among dozens of similar genre pieces. His gamble paid off. Today, it's the bees that make the movie unforgettable, the very element once deemed too odd to take seriously. On set, Statham earned a reputation for monastic discipline. He kept himself between takes, often returned to the hives just to observe the bees. Crew members described him as almost meditative, sometimes whispering lines of dialogue while watching the insects move. Some joked that he had become half Beekeeper himself. This energy bled into his performance. Clay's silence, his stillness, his almost ritualistic gestures were violence. They were rehearsed not just on the training mats, but in the presence of real bees. I love that thought, that the bees, in their small, quiet ways, coached Jason Statham as much as Ayer did. Not all production tales were romantic. The film faced logistical nightmares during night shoots. One sequence, involving a large explosion in an industrial park, triggered noise complaints from nearby neighborhoods. Local residents, unaware of what was being filmed, called authorities believing a terrorist attack was underway. Police arrived mid-shoot, and the crew had to pause until permits and explanations were sorted out. Ironically, that particular scene would later be praised for its realism. Real fear had birthed cinematic fear. Editing brought its own quirks. Fred Raskin, the editor, noted that the film's pacing was constantly at war with itself. Ayer wanted space, silence, moment of reflection. Statham's performance, however, demanded a rhythm that never slowed too much. Balancing those instincts required recutting scenes dozens of times. At one point, the film ran over 3 hours in rough cut form. Entire subplots were trimmed, including a more extensive backstory about Clay's time in the secret Beekeeper program. Some fans may mourn the loss of those details, but in truth, the cuts preserve the film's tautness. Still, somewhere out there, perhaps in a vault, exists a longer, stranger version of the Beekeeper, buzzing with lore that only a few eyes have seen. And then, there are the human quirks that never make it into press kits. Crew members tell stories of David Ayer starting every shoot day with a strange ritual. He would gather crew, read a line from poetry, sometimes Milton, sometimes Blake, and then send them to work. His reasoning? We're not making noise, we're making myth. Most of the crew rolled their eyes, but those moments stuck. I can't help but feel they infuse a film with an energy you can sense but not name, an energy that whispers. This is not just spectacle, this is allegory. When I gather all these stories together, the bees stinging their lead actor, fire going out of control, scam sets mistaken for real, poetry recited at dawn, I realized that The Beekeeper was never destined to be a straightforward action movie. It was a hive in itself, full of unpredictable movements. Chaos reigned in only by discipline, and sweetness born only after stings. That, to me, is the true fun of its production. The making of the film mirrored the film itself. A story about order against chaos was created by order wrestling with chaos. And maybe that's why the film hums with authenticity, even when it dances into exaggeration. Because at every stage it was shaped not just by craft but by mishap, not just by design but by chance. The bees were real, the stings were real, the panic was real, the poetry was real. Out of that chaos came something oddly disciplined, almost inevitable. Like honey drawn from a hive, messy in the making, but golden in the result. What lingers with me most vividly about The Beekeeper is not just the violence or the vengeance, but the spaces where these unfold. The rooms, the landscapes, the textures of light and shadow that give flesh to the story skeleton. Setting in this film is never neutral. Each location seems to carry a moral weight, as though the walls themselves know whether they're protecting life or enabling corruption. Watching it, I felt as if the environments were characters in their own right, speaking in silence, telling their own truths. It all begins with a farmhouse, a solitary dwelling surrounded by hives, fields, and silence. This is not just a home, it is a sanctuary. The wide frames linger on sunlight filtering through dust motes, on bees moving in their ordered chaos, on Statham's clay moving slowly, deliberately, among them. The colors here are warm but muted, honeyed yellows, earthy browns, and the soft hum of rural life. I thought of how literature often opens with idyls before plunging into tragedy, how Eden is always described before exile. This farmhouse is Clay's Eden, his fragile paradise. And like every Eden, it is doomed to be broken. The serenity of the setting makes the later violence feel all the more jarring, as if corruption has not only taken a life, but invaded a sacred geography. Contrast this with the call center, where the farmhouse is organic. The call center is synthetic. Rows of cubicles under cold fluorescent light, computer screens glowing like artificial suns, voices droning in scripts that are designed to deceive. The cinematography here is deliberate. The camera often frames these spaces in sharp, symmetrical lines, as though to emphasize their inhuman efficiency. It looks like a hive inverted, buzzing not with community but with exploitation. Watching it, I felt the claustrophobia of modern predation, the way real human beings are transformed into instruments of theft. It struck me that the contrast between the two settings, the farmhouse and the call center, is the entire moral battle of the film, embodied in space. One is natural order, one is manufactured chaos. Then there are the lavish mansions, the decadent palaces where the architects of corruption dwell. These settings drip with excess. Glass staircases, infinity pools, chandeliers that sparkle like they belong to a different planet than the world of Eloise's modest home. The lighting here is sterile and clinical, as though luxury itself has scrubbed away warmth. These spaces feel hollow despite their grandeur, echoing emptiness rather than life. Critically, they represent what corruption builds with the blood of the vulnerable. Whenever Clay infiltrates these mansions, his shadow seems to accuse the very walls. And when violence erupts in these sterile spaces, it feels less like action and more like a storm tearing through a palace of lies. One of the more interesting cinematic choices is the use of industrial settings, warehouses, factories, parking structures. These are not glamorous spaces, but they become battlegrounds. The cinematography often drenches them in darkness, pierced by slashes of neon or the glow of machinery, creating an atmosphere that feels both real and mythic. It is as though the film wants us to see modern industry itself as complicit, or at least indifferent, to exploitation. The hum of machines echoes the hum of bees, but in these spaces the hum is hollow, lacking harmony. The setting becomes a critique of industrial soullessness. Lighting is perhaps the film's most subtle but powerful cinematic element. Notice how the farmhouse is lit with natural light, soft and forgiving, while the spaces of corruption are dominated by artificial fluorescence or harsh spotlights. Darkness is never simply absence here. It is a stage upon which truth and lies are exposed. In scenes where Clay exacts justice, the lighting often shifts to stark contrasts, chiaroscuro reminiscent of noir, suggesting that morality itself lives in shadow, that justice is not clean but cut from darkness. To me, this visual style ties the film back to a lineage of cinematic traditions, noir westerns, even biblical epics where light and shadow carried moral meaning. Cinematography often frames Clay alone, even in the midst of chaos. Wide shots emphasize his isolation, small against sprawling corruption. Tight close-ups, by contrast, capture the calm intensity in his eyes, the discipline that separates him from the frantic energy of his enemies. The visual language reinforces the idea that he is both part of and apart from the world, a man of the hive, yet outside it. I found myself thinking of Kurosawa's Ronin wandering into corrupt villages, or the gunslinger walking into a western town. The camera tells us, here is a man who does not belong, and precisely because of that, he is the only one capable of restoring balance. Even the use of sound intersects with setting. The farmhouse hums with bees, the city with traffic, the call center with scripted chatter. These soundscapes are not incidental. They define each space's moral temperature. The sound design reminds us where life is nurtured and where it is drained. What struck me is how often silence intrudes. After violence, the film will cut to sudden quiet, leaving us alone with buzzing bees or the creak of wood. These moments felt like moral pauses, cinematic breaths asking us to reflect on what we've just seen. The climactic settings are particularly powerful. When Clay storms the core of the operation, the film moves into spaces that are almost abstract. High-rises gleaming in glass, offices that look more like temples of money than workplaces. Here, the camera often tilts upward, dwarfing Clay against structures designed to symbolize invincibility. Yet as he dismantles them, the settings collapse in meaning. What once seemed impenetrable is revealed as fragile. This inversion is one of the film's sharpest symbolic tricks, showing that power structures, for all their towering facades, crumble when someone refuses to bow to them. Finally, the return to the farmhouse closes the circle. The same setting that opened the film greets us again, but now it is changed. Or perhaps it is we who are changed. The hum of the bees is the same, the light is the same, but we cannot see it with the same innocence. It is no longer Eden, but a sanctuary scarred by loss. The setting itself feels heavier, reminding us that peace is never absolute. It must be defended, and defending it comes at a cost. What makes the cinematic elements of the Beekeeper so compelling is their coherence. Every space, every light, every hum is part of a language. The farmhouse speaks of order. The call center speaks of corruption. The mansions speak of decadence. The warehouses speak of soulless machinery. And the return to bees speaks of cycles, of balance that can be restored, but never permanently. This is cinema working as literature, setting not as backdrop, but as symbol, as moral architecture. And for me, that is why the Beekeeper lingers. Not because of its explosions or its fistfights, though those are crafted with skill, but because when I close my eyes, I can still see the sunlight on wooden hives, still hear the hum of bees, still feel the sterility of offices that drain lives, still sense the cold hollowness of mansions built on misery. These images live on because they're more than visuals. They are truths, painted with light and sound, carved into memory by a film that understands the world is always shaped by the spaces we inhabit. Behind every polished action sequence lies a messy world of sweat, improvisation, accidents, and camaraderie. The Beekeeper was no exception. If anything, the process of creating this film often mirrored its story. order constantly battling chaos, and victory achieved only through persistence. To watch the finished movie is to see something lean, sharp, and purposeful. To hear the tales from the set is to realize how fragile that order was, how easily it could have tipped into disaster, and how many people had to steady the hive for it to thrive. One of the earliest behind the scenes tensions arose around tone. David Ayer came in wanting grit. Something raw and close to bone, a movie that felt as real as in a Watch or Fury. Jason Statham, by contrast, arrived with a sense of ritual precision. He approached every scene like choreography, drilling moves again and again until they were second nature. At first, this created friction. Ayer wanted spontaneity. Statham wanted control. Crew members recalled long evenings where director and star would argue over whether a fight should look sloppy and brutal or clean and surgical. But in those debates, a strange chemistry was born. The fights in the finished film feel both real and mythic, messy yet exact, because they're the child of two competing visions. What might have been a clash became the film's unique DNA. Then came the bees themselves. The production had insisted on bringing real bees onto set, partly for authenticity, partly because Ayer wanted that hum to be genuine. They hired professional apiarists to handle the hives. But bees are not actors. They do not follow scripts. On warm days, they behaved peacefully. On colder or stormier days, they grew agitated. More than once, filming had to stop when entire swarms became restless, flooding lights and lenses. Statham himself was stung on multiple occasions, though he reportedly refused to flinch. "You respect them, they respect you," he told a crew member, though his red, swollen hand told a different story. Some joked that the bees were the strictest union on set. If conditions weren't right, production simply couldn't go forward. Sound design carried its own amusing complications. The audio crew had hours of footage ruined because the bees' hum bled into microphones at unpredictable volumes. At first, this was seen as a disaster. But then, in post-production, the team decided to embrace it. They wove those hums into the soundtrack, slowed down and layered into ominous drones beneath the score. In other words, accidents became art. And that's the story of so much filmmaking. What begins as an obstacle transforms into a gift if you're open to it. The call center set sparked one of the strangest behind-the-scenes episodes. Designed to mimic a real scam operation, it was so convincing that at one point local authorities thought it was real. An anonymous tip had been made about suspicious activity in the building. Police visited, only to find actors pretending to scam fictional victims. The crew laughed it off later, but for a brief moment, fiction nearly became indistinguishable from reality. Isn't that eerie? That a movie about scams almost became mistaken for one? The stunts brought their own behind-the-scenes legends. Jason Statham is famous for doing most of his own work, but this film pushed even him. In one scene involving fire, he insisted on going without a double. The flames spread unpredictably, and Ayer nearly called cut, but Statham barreled through, improvising his escape. That take made it into the final film. Watching it, you'd never know you were seeing a genuine moment of panic turned into performance. Later, stunt coordinators admitted their hair went gray that day. Editing was another crucible. The first assembly of the movie ran over 3 hours. It included a long subplot about Clay's deeper past in the Beekeeper program. Training sequences, missions hinted at in shadow. In test screenings, however, audiences felt the digressions pulled too much focus away from the central revenge story. Reluctantly, Ayer trimmed it down, leaving hints instead of full exposition. Somewhere, locked away in an editing suite, lies a longer, stranger version of Beekeeper, one that dives further into mythology of the secret order. Fans may never see it, but its ghost lingers. But perhaps the richest behind-the-scenes insights are not about accidents or cuts, but about human rituals. David Ayer, known for his intensity, began each day on set by gathering the crew and reading a line of poetry. Sometimes it was Blake, sometimes Milton, sometimes something it scrawled in a notebook. His reasoning? We're not making noise. We're making myth. At first, some rolled their eyes, but as days stretched into weeks, the ritual became grounding. People remembered those lines long after the shoot. They whispered them during setups, recited them over lunch. In the end, Those small moments of reflection gave the film its heartbeat. There's also the story of camaraderie that only happens when people suffer together. Night shoots in cold rain, equipment failures, long hours in abandoned warehouses. All of it forged bonds. Crew members joked about becoming a hive themselves, each with a role, each enduring the sting for the sake of the honey. It's fitting, isn't it, that a film about beekeepers turns its own crew into one? And then there are the things we'll never see on screen, but which shaped the movie's spirit. A storm that halted shooting. Leaving Statham standing alone under rain, watching lightning with bees still humming in their hives nearby. A prop computer accidentally connecting to real internet traffic, nearly mimicking a scam. A costume designer sneaking bee motifs into Clay's clothing, hexagon stitching honey gold linings. So subtle you'd miss them unless you looked. Taken together, these insights reveal that the making of the Beekeeper was never smooth, never neat. It was a constant struggle between chaos and order, bees swarming, actors arguing, storms interrupting, accidents birthing beauty, which is exactly what the film itself is about. Perhaps that's why it feels so authentic. Because the making of it was not pretend. It was lived chaos, sculpted into order, art drawn from stings and sweat. What makes the Beekeeper rise above the level of just another revenge thriller is not the choreography of its fights or precision of its pacing, but the symbols that hum beneath it all. This is a film drenched in metaphor. So much so that it sometimes feels less like an action movie and more like a parable wearing the costume of an action movie. The bees, the hive, the cycle of order and chaos, all of these carry a weight far greater than spectacle. To explore them is to find the marrow of the story, the truth that lingers long after the explosions fade. The most obvious theme, and yet the one richest in layers, is the hive itself. The hive represents society, fragile, interdependent, requiring balance and protection. Bees thrive only in harmony, and when threatened, they rally to defend their community. The tragedy of Eloise is not just that she is one woman destroyed by a scam. It is that the hive failed her. She was left exposed, alone, and the predators feasted without consequence. The Beekeeper, then, becomes less a man than a metaphor, the guardian who steps in when a hive's defenses collapse. Critically, this is not just about him avenging a neighbor. It is about restoring balance to a community fractured by corruption. Violence, in this framework, takes on symbolic meaning. Clay does not wield violence like an ordinary action hero, with swagger or bravado. His violence is surgical, ritualistic, almost monastic. He prunes diseased branches to save the tree. He eradicates parasites so that the hive may live. In mythology, violence often carries its duality, destructive on the surface, restorative in essence. Clay embodies this paradox. He is both destroyer and protector, both shadow and light. In him, violence becomes a metaphor for purification, a cleansing fire that makes way for renewal. Another powerful theme is corruption disguised as order. The scam call centers mimic the structure of a hive, buzzing workers, each with their task, but inverted. Instead of sustaining life, they drain it. The mansions of the powerful mimic stability, order, success, but they are hollow, parasitic. The Congresswoman cloaks exploitation in the language of public duty. This inversion of symbols is critical. The film is not only about good versus evil, but about false hives versus true hives. Some structures pretend to be communities, pretend to serve, but in truth they exploit. The Beekeeper's role is not just to fight enemies, but to expose the false hives, to burn them down so that something authentic might survive. One of the subtler themes that struck me is the tension between solitude and responsibility. Clay begins in solitude, tending bees, withdrawn from the world. He longs for peace, for quiet repetition. But peace proves impossible when the hive around him collapses. His arc suggests that solitude is not enough. Responsibility to the hive is unavoidable. In literature, this theme recurs often. The hero who wants only to be left alone is summoned to act by the suffering of others. Clay represents a paradox of human life. We long for solitude, but we cannot escape responsibility. The hum of the hive is always calling us back. The theme of justice versus vengeance also hums through the narrative. On the surface, Clay is avenging Eloise. But step deeper, and you realize his mission is less about personal revenge and more about systemic justice. He is not angry only for her, but for everyone like her. Every vulnerable soul preyed upon by systems of exploitation. The distinction matters. Vengeance is selfish, a closed circle. Justice, even when violent, opens outward, aiming to restore balance with community. The film never explicitly answers whether Clay is avenger or guardian. Instead, it leaves us to wrestle with the ambiguity, which makes the story resonate all the more. The bees themselves, of course, are the most enduring symbol. They are more than metaphor. They are chorus. Their hum permeates the soundscape, a constant reminder of balance, of fragility, of interdependence. They represent not just the world Clay protects, but the philosophy he embodies. Patience, discipline, sacrifice of the hive. To me, the bees are like the chorus in Greek tragedy. They do not speak directly, but they remind us of the stakes, of the moral weight of what is unfolding. Their presence elevates the film into something mythic. Even the title itself is symbolic. The Beekeeper is not merely a man tending insects. It is a title, a mantle, an identity passed down through a secret order. It suggests guardianship, secrecy, discipline, but it also suggests fragility. A beekeeper is powerful not because he dominates, but because he protects. His job is not conquest, but stewardship. In this way, the film redefines heroism. The true hero is not the conqueror, but the protector, the one who ensures the hive survives. Symbolism also threads through the settings. The farmhouse represents Eden, order, innocence. The call center represents false hives, perversions of order. The mansions represent corruption built on decay. The warehouses represent soulless machinery. Each space is more than a backdrop. It is a moral architecture, a symbol in stone and steel. The return of the farmhouse at the end is symbolic too, a cycle closed, order temporarily restored. But the scar remains. Eloise is gone. The hive survives, but it has lost members. This echoes eternal theme. Justice does not erase loss, it only balances it. Another theme that resonated with me is that of silence and speech. Clay is a man of few words, and his silence is heavy with meaning. He embodies action over talk, conviction over rhetoric. The villains, by contrast, drown in words. Scammers reciting scripts, politicians spouting empty promises, corruption cloaked in eloquence. The film critiques a world where words are often tools of exploitation and reminds us that truth is found not in speech, but in action. Silence, in this story, becomes more powerful than rhetoric. There is also the theme of inevitability. From the moment Eloise falls, Clay's path feels preordained. He does not want to return to violence, but he must. He does not want to confront corruption, but he cannot ignore it. This inevitability echoes mythic patterns. The reluctant hero who cannot escape his fate, the avenger called to balance the scales. It suggests that in every hive, there comes a time when someone must answer the call, no matter their reluctance. It is less choice than destiny. For me, perhaps the most haunting theme is the fragility of the hive itself. Society, like a beehive, is always vulnerable. It can be protected, balanced, sustained, but it is never invincible. Corruption, like disease, always lurks, always waits for weakness. The beekeeper's role, then, is never finished. Even after balance is restored, vigilance must continue. This theme resonates far beyond the film. It speaks to our own lives, our own communities. Who are our beekeepers? Who stands guard when the hive is under attack? And what happens when no one answers? In the end, the beekeeper is not really about one man fighting corruption. It is about the eternal struggle between order and chaos, between true hives and false ones, between solitude and responsibility. Its symbols hum in the background, asking us not just to watch, but to reflect. And that is why, for me, the film feels less like entertainment and more like allegory. It buzzes with questions that outlive the credits, questions that linger like the hum of bees in our ears long after the theater goes dark. What makes The Beekeeper so fascinating to me is that it's not just a story or performances that linger. It's the way the film was built, brick by brick, frame by frame, through choices of craft. The techniques here are as much a language as a dialogue, shaping what we feel, even when we don't consciously notice. Watching it carefully, I began to see how every shot, every edit, every sound cue was placed like a worker bee in a hive, small on its own, but essential to the whole. And then beyond craft, there's a strange tale of how the film buzzed its way through the box office, defying expectations. Let's begin with the camera. David Ayer's style has always leaned toward the tactile, the grounded, the sense that we are in the dirt with the characters. In The Beekeeper, he brought that realism into a genre that usually thrives on stylization. The camera often hugs close to Clay's movements, following his fists, his steps, his breathing, so that action feels not like spectacle but like survival. At other times, it pulls back into wide frames, emphasizing his isolation, a lone figure against sprawling corruption. The shift between intimacy and distance becomes a kind of rhythm. Close when we need to feel his precision, distant when we need to remember how small he is against the system. I thought of Kurosawa's samurai films in this. The way a man alone can fill a frame, yet still look dwarfed by the world around him. Editing, too, plays a crucial role. Fred Raskin's cuts are sharp but not frantic. Modern action films often drown in hyperactive editing, never allowing a shot to breathe. Here, however, fights are cut to preserve clarity. You always know where Clay is, what he's doing, why it matters. This creates a sense of control, mirroring Clay's own discipline. Yet there are moments when the edit deliberately fractures, cutting quicker, jarring us, to mimic the chaos of the world he is tearing apart. It's a dance between order and disorder, editing as metaphor. I found myself thinking of literature again, how some writers use long sentences to soothe and short ones to shock. The film edits like a novelist punctuating a page. Sound design may be the film's most ingenious technical layer. As I mentioned before, the hum of bees is woven into the score, stretched, deepened, layered until it becomes atmosphere. Sometimes it's subtle. You feel a low vibration but don't consciously register it. Sometimes it swells, rising almost like a choir, accompanying Clay's movements. The effect is haunting. Nature itself becomes part of the soundtrack of justice. Beyond bees, the soundscape emphasizes contrasts. The sterile chatter of scammers, the hollow echo of empty mansions, the metallic groan of warehouses. Each space has its own sound signature, its own moral temperature. The sound tells you whether you are in a space of life or a space of corruption. The score, by David Sardi, fuses electronic and orchestral elements. Strings swell not in triumph but in tension. Percussion strikes not in rhythm but in jagged bursts. The electronic hum, borrowed from bees, grounds a whole thing in unease. What I loved is that the music never tries to be heroic. It is not the soundtrack of a conquering warrior but a reluctant guardian, a man who takes no joy in what he must do. It reminded me of minimalist composers like Johann Johansson. Scores that ache rather than celebrate. Lighting, too, works as silent storytelling. Natural light fills a farmhouse, soft and golden, making it feel sacred. Artificial fluorescence dominates the call centers, making them look lifeless, almost sickly. Neon and harsh contrasts paint the industrial spaces, echoing corruption's coldness. In climactic battles, shadows dominate, chiaroscuro framing Clay as a man who lives between light and darkness. The lighting is moral language, warm where there is life, cold where there is predation, shadowed where there is ambiguity. It is visual philosophy, whispered through light. The choreography of fights deserves its own reflection. Statham's style has always been efficient, but here it is pared down even further. Each move is about ending conflict quickly, no flourish, no indulgence. It's not entertainment choreography, it's survival choreography. Watching him dismantle opponents, I realize the fights themselves are metaphors. They are not about showing off power, but about excising infection. Every broken arm, every collapsed guard, every toppled figure is less victory than purification. Even violence becomes technique, a philosophy expressed through motion. And then, of course, comes the question of the box office. Many assumed The Beekeeper will be another mid-tier January release, forgotten within weeks. Instead, it became one of the biggest surprises of 2024. With a budget of around $40 million, it clawed its way past $150 million worldwide, An astonishing return for a film critics dismissed as pulpy revenge fare. But audiences responded. They didn't just come for Statham's fists. They came for the metaphor, even if they couldn't name it. Word of mouth spread. People said, it's not just action, it's deeper. Some joked that it was John Wick with bees. But beneath the jokes was genuine respect. Why did it succeed? I think because in a world where people feel constantly exploited by systems, scams, corporations, politics, the fantasy of a lone guardian resonated. The hive imagery spoke unconsciously to audiences. Everyone knows what it feels like to be part of a hive under threat. Everyone longs for a beekeeper. The box office then becomes less about numbers and more about resonance. The film became a cultural hum, buzzing louder than its budget should have allowed. Critically, it was divisive. Some dismissed it as cliché. Others praised its allegorical richness. But the box office proved something critics often forget. Audiences respond not just to novelty, but to myth. This story, cloaked in bees and stings, tapped into something eternal. The longing for justice, the fear of corruption, the fragility of community. That is why people bought tickets. That is why it kept buzzing long after its release weekend. For me, the most striking thing about the techniques and the commercial story of The Beekeeper is how they mirror each other. The film's craft is all about balance, between clarity and chaos, silence and sound, light and shadow. Its box office journey is the same, a balance between critics' dismissal and audiences' embrace, between small budget and big returns. In both cases, the hive survived, order was restored, and the hum of bees, cinematic, symbolic, cultural, carried on. When I think about The Beekeeper, I don't just remember the story or the symbols, but the people who embodied them. Jason Statham, of course, stand at the center, but he isn't alone. Around him are actors who gave shape to corruption, to conscience, to vulnerability. And beyond them are the voices of audiences, critics, interviewers, the hive outside the hive, buzzing with their own reactions. Statham's performance as Adam Clay may be one of his most stripped down. Gone are the smirks, the one-liners, the stylish flourishes that made him famous in earlier action films. Here, he is pared back to silence, precision, stillness. In interviews, he admitted that this role felt more personal than many others. He described Clay as a man of ritual, someone who lived by discipline but is forced to use it for destruction. He also spoke about spending time with real beekeepers before filming, learning how to move with patience, how to respect the hive. It fascinated me that an actor known for explosive movement would train in stillness, to hold himself like a man who has lived among bees. That stillness bleeds through the screen, and it is why Clay never feels like an action caricature, but like a real man carrying unbearable weight. Opposite him, Jeremy Irons, always a master of presence, takes on the role of Wallace Westwild, the polished political manipulator whose calm voice hides rot. Irons admitted in press junkets that he enjoyed playing someone whose poison is spoken in whispers, not shouts. Watching him, I was struck by how his calmness made him more terrifying than any shouting villain could. His voice, smooth and deliberate, carried the weight of institutions, as though corruption itself had gone to finishing school. Josh Hutcherson, cast as Derek Danforth, the entitled son, surprised many, known to audiences for roles in Hunger Games and lighter projects. Here he leaned into arrogance and recklessness. Interviews revealed that he relished the chance to be hated. He called Derek the kind of person you recognize instantly from real life, the person who's never been told no. It's true. His performance feels less like acting and more like channeling the ugliness of privilege. Audiences seem to agree. Social media buzz with comments like, "I've never wanted to see a villain punch more in my life." Sometimes, being loathed is the highest form of success for an actor. Emmy Raver-Lampman, playing FBI agent Verona Parker, gave the film its conscience. In interviews, she spoke about wanting Verona to represent the audience's moral struggle, someone torn between enforcing the law and recognizing when the law fails justice. Her performance anchors the film's gray areas. She doesn't steal scenes with flash, but she lingers because she embodies a question we're left with. What do you do when right and legal no longer align? Critics highlighted her as a standout, praising the way she played Verona not as an action foil, but as a human being struggling in real time. Phylicia Rashad's presence as Eloise gave the story its heart. Though her screen time is short, her warmth permeates the film. Rashad spoke tenderly in interviews about how she saw Eloise as the soul of the hive, a symbol of all those who trust and are betrayed. She said that when she read the script, she wept because she knew women like Eloise in real life, people who had been destroyed by systems they didn't understand. That authenticity shows. Her absence drives the entire film, and her performance makes us feel that absence as more than a plot device. Even beyond the main cast, smaller roles carried weight. Actors portraying call center scammers, for example, were coached to maintain a robotic cheerfulness, a performance that critics noted was unnervingly authentic. One actor confessed that after a week of rehearsing scam scripts, he started dreaming in them, waking up with phrases like, "We're here to help you secure your account." That eerie detail seeps into the performances, making them feel less like characters and more like symptoms of disease. The cast often spoke about the atmosphere on set as intense, but strangely communal. Statham kept mostly to himself, often silent between takes, but he was fiercely protective of his co-stars, insisting they feel safe during physical scenes. Hutcherson admitted he felt genuinely intimidated filming confrontations with Statham, not because Statham was hostile, but because his presence was so commanding. Irons, ever the seasoned veteran, reportedly lightened tension by quoting Shakespeare between takes, reminding everyone that even revenge thrillers have roots in ancient tragedy. When the film reached audiences, the hive outside the theater came alive. Reactions were divided, but passionate. Some viewers hailed it as Statham's best work in years, praising its allegorical depth. Others dismissed it as another revenge thriller, unable or unwilling to look past the action surface. What struck me, though, was how often ordinary viewers, not critics, latched onto the Beast symbolism. Social media buzzed appropriately, with memes about Bewick, Buzz Lightyear with shotgun, and honey-coated justice. But beneath the jokes, people were engaging with the metaphor. One audience member wrote, "It made me think about my grandma getting scammed. I wish someone like Clay existed." That, I think, is a true measure of impact when a story sparks personal connections. Box office reviews carried their own narrative. Trade publications were stunned at how strongly the film performed for a January release, a month often considered a dumping ground. Analysts admitted they underestimated audiences' hunger for myth disguised as pulp. Interviews with viewers revealed that many went in expecting generic action and came out surprised at how symbolic it felt. That gap between expectation and delivery fueled word of mouth. What fascinated me most was how international audiences responded. In countries like Brazil and India, where scams and corruption are often part of everyday life, the film resonated deeply. Critics there spoke about how Clay felt like a folk hero, not because of his fists, but because of his guardianship. In the UK, audiences picked up on the rural authenticity of the beekeeping imagery. In the US, viewers latched onto its political critique. Each region seemed to read the symbolism through its own hive, its own vulnerabilities. That, to me, proves the universality of the themes. So when I think of the cast and the voices around them, I don't just see actors delivering lines. I see Statham meditating with bees. I see Rashad carrying the soul of the film in her warmth. I see Hutcherson leaning into ugliness, Irons whispering poison with elegance, Lampman giving us our conscience. And I hear audiences buzzing, critics clashing, viewers carrying the hive home with them. In the end, the cast brought the hive to life, and the audience became part of it. The film was never just watched. It was inhabited, argued over, memed, loved, dismissed, but always felt. There comes a moment, after a film has unspooled its images and its sound has faded, when we are left in silence. It is in that silence that we discover whether the story lingers, whether it has touched something deeper than the eyes, whether it has entered the bloodstream of thought. The Beekeeper ends not with spectacle, not with speeches, but with quiet, the hum of bees, the calm return to ritual, the reminder that balance, once disrupted, can never truly be restored without cost. And as I sat with it, letting the silence sink in, I realized this was never a film about violence at all. It was a film about guardianship, about responsibility, about the fragile beauty of the hive we all share. What strikes me, looking back across everything we've explored together, is how the film manages to live on two levels at once. On the surface, it is lean and muscular, an action thriller that delivers its promise of chases, fights, and vengeance. But beneath that surface, it is something much older, almost mythic. The Beekeeper is not just Adam Clay, retired operative turned reluctant avenger. He is an archetype, the silent guardian who emerges when a hive is threatened, the reluctant hero who carries the burden no one else dares to lift. Stories like his have existed for millennia, and perhaps that is why this one resonates. It reminds us that though technology changes, though scams now come through glowing screens instead of swords, the need for guardianship never disappears. The themes hum together like wings in rhythm. The hive as society, fragile and interdependent. The bees as chorus, reminding us of balance and sacrifice. Violence as paradox, destructive yet restorative. Corruption as false order, wearing the mask of legitimacy while draining life. Solitude clashing with responsibility, vengeance colliding with justice. All of these are not just cinematic devices, but human truths. We see them in our headlines, in our neighborhoods, in the faces of those who are exploited and those who profit. That is why this film works. Because beneath its adrenaline, it is asking questions we live with every day. What makes the conclusion of the story so poignant is that it does not pretend to give final answers. Eloise does not come back. Corruption is not wiped from the earth. Clay himself remains in solitude, returning to bees not with innocence but with scars. Justice is never clean, never permanent. It must be enacted again and again by whoever has the strength to step forward. The hum at the end is not comfort, but reminder. The work is never done. That is what makes the story honest. Too many films wrap themselves in triumphalism, as if one victory redeems everything. The Beekeeper refuses that lie. It admits that life is more fragile, more complicated. And in that honesty, it becomes more powerful. Looking at the craft, I see the same balance. The camera moving between intimacy and distance, reminding us that Clay is both individual and archetype. The editing cutting between clarity and chaos, echoing the struggle between order and disorder. The sound weaving the real hum of bees into the score, transforming accident into atmosphere. The lighting painting morality into every frame. Warm where there's life, cold where there's predation, shadow where there's ambiguity. This was not just craft for its own sake. It was craft as philosophy, technique serving meaning. That is why even its smallest details resonate. Behind the scenes, too, the film mirrored its story. Real bees disrupting cameras. Actors stung into humility. Sets mistaken for real scams. Poetry read at dawn. Fire scenes veering out of control. It was chaos transformed into order. Accidents turned into art. A hive of humans buzzing towards something larger than themselves. Perhaps that is why the film feels so authentic. It was born not from smoothness, but from struggle. It was a hive surviving its own storms. And then there is the audience, the hive beyond the hive. Critics divided, some dismissing it, some praising it, but ordinary viewers connecting in ways that critics did not predict. People saw their grandparents in Eloise, their anger in Clay, their frustration with corruption in Derek and his mother. They carried the story into memes, into discussions, into their own reflections. In Brazil, in India, in the UK, in the US, people found themselves in a hive. That universality is the mark of a true fable. It may wear the mask of genre, but it speaks to something common, something shared. So where does that leave us as we close this long reflection? For me, it leaves us with questions. Who are our beekeepers? Who stands guard over our hives, our families, our communities, our fragile societies? What happens when no one answers the call? And perhaps most unsettling, are we willing, if needed, to be beekeepers ourselves? To sacrifice solitude for responsibility, silence for action, comfort for guardianship? These are not questions the film answers, but then no story truly does. Stories don't answer, they stir, they unsettle. They leave us buzzing with thoughts, restless with possibilities. In the end, The Beekeeper is not just about a man avenging a neighbor. It is about the eternal battle between exploitation and guardianship, between false hives and true ones, between the predators who drain and the protectors who defend. It tells us that justice is fragile, that peace is fleeting, but that dignity is always worth defending. It hums with a reminder that the hive only survives if someone is willing to stand again and again against the chaos that threatens it. And so, as I close this journey with you, my dear companions in cinema and literature, I find myself grateful for stories like this. Not because they entertain, though they do, but because they remind us of truths we too easily forget. That life is fragile. That community is everything. That corruption lurks always at the edge. And that somewhere, somehow, there must always be a beekeeper. If you've come this far with me, thank you. Thank you for walking into the hive, for listening to the hum beneath the action, for seeking meaning where others only see fists. If you found resonance here, if you felt the sting of truth alongside me, I invite you to stay with Cinema Vault, to subscribe, to keep exploring these myths and metaphors with me. Because the hive is not just on screen. It is here, in this community of seekers and thinkers, buzzing together. And like every hive, it survives only when we protect it, only when we keep listening for the hum.